What worries you most about a presidential cabinet filled with Trump loyalists?
Well, I think the biggest worry is having Trump running the cabinet, especially with his comments about him being a dictator on day one and continuing to look for people who are putting loyalty first and then our country. So that is definitely a huge concern because they're all pledging their support to Trump, which is more of a authoritarianist idea that Trump would be before country.
One of the critiques of his first term is that he didn't fully understand, appreciate how to use the levers of government. And one of the concerns when you think about the possibility of a second term is that there is at least a greater understanding than there was the first time of how to do that. And so from that vantage point, understanding that he now understands where power lies substantively, what does that mean? And for you, for members of Congress, what does that mean about the job that you will then be called upon to do?
I think we're going to have a gridlock. At the end of the day, when you have Trump who's handpicking these authoritarian cheerleaders who are going to do what he wants them to do, regardless of how it affects our nation, and regardless of how it affects even members and the people who rely on the help from the government, they're going to just be carrying out this agenda. And this agenda is going to be an extreme agenda. If we look at what's going on with Congress right now, we spend most of our time voting on things that don't affect people, especially on the bottom line. We're voting on paying people $1. We're voting on things like censure, but we're not doing the people's work. And Trump isn't even president. So what's going to be like with him being president? I think it's going to be a lot more interference. It's going to be a lot more theater. And it's going to be a lot more dangerous authoritarian views and viewpoints, especially when it comes to immigration, especially when it comes to having these investigations against his opponents. He's going to be really retaliating in a way that we've never seen before. And I think we have to take into consideration that he would have no threat of being reelected. So he can do whatever he wants to do, full range, and really have no threat because he feels like it's his way now and no one could stop him. And that's what's the biggest, scariest point about this. I think the American people have been saying more and more when it came to even abortion that they want to have more independence in choosing their lifestyle. But that's not Trump's agenda, nor is it his cabinet. And if we look at everyone he's looking at, they truly are Trump cheerleaders and not American people first. And that's what's scary about this. How far will we go? I think we need to take seriously what Trump said when he said on day one he'll be a dictator. We have to ask ourselves, hey, does he, why a dictator? Out of all the people in the world, why would you say a dictator when we're talking about retaliation? When dictators retaliate, they murder, they kill, they intimidate, and they ensure that there's authoritarian government in place. It's not actually a place to position and a springboard for democracy. And that's really what he's looking to do, and that's scary.
Okay, so that is your point of view from here on Earth 1. Over on Earth 2, where Ron DeSantis apparently lives during the Republican presidential debate this week, he, if you can believe this, he criticized Trump for not being more extreme. Take a listen.
Look, the media is making a big deal about what he said about some of these comments. I would just remind people that is not how he governed. He didn't even fire Dr. Fauci. He didn't fire Christopher Wray. He didn't clean up the swamp. He said he was going to drain it. He did not drain it. He said he was going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. We don't have the wall. He did say in 2016 he'd have the largest deportation program in history. He deported less than Barack Obama did when Barack Obama was president. So some of these policies he ran on in 2016. I was cheering him on then, but he didn't deliver it.
As a Floridian, you are very familiar with Governor DeSantis's policy positions, the way that is not just spoken ideology on a debate stage. It actually has played out in your state in a number of ways. A reminder that in as much as we can sit here and talk about Donald Trump, Trumpism has taken a hold of this party.
Yep. You're exactly right. I mean, at this point, it seems like everyone's trying to be more extreme than Trump. And we know that Governor DeSantis is one of those people who are trying to out-Trump Trump. But unfortunately, trying to do that doesn't actually gain you more popular support. We're seeing that anybody who's trying to go further than Trump is actually sinking.